Evening, everyone, and welcome to our AY program. So this evening we have two presenters, Miss McCoy and Miss Happy from the Department of Health, and they will be talking to us about COVID-19 and coping with stress during this time. And at this time, they will tell us more about themselves and just listen and hope we will learn something and we'll take away something from this afternoon program. You can start, Miss Happy and Miss McCoy.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
Chloe.
Chloe. We really appreciate that. Thank you for the introductions. Thank you all so much for being here. So good afternoon slash evening, right? And so, Miss Slowly said, my name is Sharifa Happy. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. We do work at the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Before I go even further, I want to go ahead and just have my colleague introduce herself and explain her roles. She's going to be doing a lot of the behind the scenes work, and she's really incredible. So, Teresa.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate the introduction, and we just want to make sure that everyone gets everything that they need today. And so, in that vein, in that way of thinking, what I'd like to do is to make sure to ensure that everyone's registered. It's really important to make sure that it happens. And for the majority of you are, and that's congratulations. And there are a few individuals that are not. So part of my role is to ensure that that happens. So if you would, I'm going to have a chat with you. That's going to be the means of communication. And if there is any, and that's at the bottom of the screen, and if there's any concerns or anything that comes up, this can be somewhat heavy material at different points in time. If you need to communicate with me for any matter, please do so via chat. In addition, I will be communicating with those individuals asking for your
So,
your full name and telephone number so that I can complete the
I
registration
cannot come on
process.
phone.
Okay, so also because this is a very important conversation that is about to happen, respectfully, I would like for everyone, if you would, initially to put yourselves on mute or ensure that you're on mute so that you can hear Sharifa and her message to everyone today. Let's see, what else? I think that's about it for now. Okay. But thank you so much for participating in this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And like Teresa said, you can privately message her and using the chat. We'll be using the chat a lot. So if everyone can just open up their chat, you'll see that at the bottom you can send to, and right now in blue it says everyone. You can even privately message Teresa if you need support by changing the everyone to Teresa. So that way, if you need any help, any support, anything at all, she'll be there. And so it's really important. And it's also important we get some practice using the chat because we'll be asking some questions and having conversations throughout. So let's actually get some practice right now, right? So everyone in the chat, right? Go ahead and let us know what's your favorite dessert, all right? So as you can see, I'm kind of hungry. So let us know right now, what's your favorite dessert so that we can get to know each other a little bit too. All right. So as I'm waiting for people to go ahead and put it in the chat, I also want to welcome and invite everyone to go ahead and turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable. You are not being forced to turn on your camera. It's if you feel comfortable, but it does help us make the class a little bit more interactive. Also, it helps me feel a little bit less lonely on my end. And if you choose not to turn on your camera, I understand. Don't worry. My bottom half is PJs. I only threw on a blazer and stuff, so I get it. Right? We're all at home. Right? So I see a lot of people with ice cream. Collins had fruitcake. All right, Dean James, I see sweet potato pie. Right? We're all coming off wait, yes, Thanksgiving, everything, right? So I see Shannon strawberry cheesecake, banana bread from Jennifer. You're saying ice cream, right? Ooh, Rachel, creme brulee. I love creme brulee, right? More ice cream. I love this so much. And more sweet potato pudding and so much ice cream. I am really hungry right now. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into our conversation, right? So thank you all so much for participating in our chat and our a little bit of an icebreaker. So with that, let's dive into our conversation about COVID-19 community conversations, where we'll be discussing how our mental health has been impacted. We'll be talking about equity, right? What's been prevalent, what's been going on. We'll also be talking about resilience. How can we be resilient and stay strong? How can we bounce forward, right? I know a lot of times we hear the term bouncing back, but we're not really going back to the same world we always had. We're learning to adapt to this new world, right? So we're bouncing forward. So and to do this, we need to also acknowledge that New York City and the entire world has been impacted in so many different ways, right? And to with all of the impact, with everything that's been going on, we collectively are working to build resilience together, right? So before we go on, we know this is a heavy topic. We know that, with everything that's happened, that many of us may have lost so many loved ones. Many of us may have lost so many things that are important to us. Many of us have been through so much, right? So to be able to acknowledge that, we're going to take a quick moment of silence to and so please join us in that moment of silence together. Thank you all so much for joining us in the moment of silence. It's important to acknowledge everything that we've been through, right? And so, with that, again, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please do put it in the chat. And you can also privately message Teresa by changing your send to Teresa. All right. And she may have already contacted you for attendance. So I see you're nodding. So that's wonderful. So let's dive in and see what we're going to be looking at today. All right. So we know that it's COVID-19 community conversations. So the context of our conversation is going to be on the rate and impact of COVID-19, but specifically on BIPOC communities, right? So Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Has anyone here ever heard of the term BIPOC? Right? You can put it in the chat, you can nod your head, or so I see a lot of us shaking our heads, and that's absolutely okay, right? In fact, most people say no, right? So BIPOC, BIPOC, stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. We may have heard terms like minorities or people of color, right? But the thing is, we're trying to actually veer away from those terms because we're trying to actually be more inclusive of the experiences of marginalized communities, right? When we say people of color or minorities, what we're doing is we're taking the experiences of all different peoples of color, all different communities of peoples of color, right? And we're saying that they all have the same experience. We're saying that they all have the same history of experience. But we know not all communities of color have histories of whether it's Jim Crow, redlining, and so on, right? So it's important we acknowledge that. So that's why you're going to hear us use the term BIPOC a lot. And we know we're going to be talking about building resilience. Where's the help, right? We talk about these resources, but where are those resources? So we'll be sharing those as well, right? And so let's think about it. With everything that we're going on and we're going to be talking about today, why is this conversation important? Right? So, question for you, go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can even unmute yourself and we'll take maybe one or two people. Why is this conversation important to you? Why did you choose to come here today? Right? So, again, you can unmute yourself. We'll take maybe one person, and if or you could put it in the chat. I see some people typing. So, let's think about why is this conversation important to us?
Um, it's it's important because we want to know what's going on. Because
Yeah.
many of us doesn't understand certain things, so I really want to know what is going on.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Miss Cottle. I absolutely. What's going on, right? Because here's the thing: we've all of our lives have been disrupted in some way, right? And here's the thing: this tiny virus that we can't even see, it's practically taking over our lives, right? And we're still trying to figure out what's going on, what's happening, right? And so, absolutely. And Colin mentioned COVID is deadly, and the effects of it are far-reaching, and it impacts us as a nation and as a people, right? So we're not just being impacted individually; we're being impacted on a governmental, whether it's local or state. We're being impacted in our communities, in our cultural institutions, even in our religious institutions, even in our within our families, amongst our friends. We're all being affected, and globally, we're being affected, right? And when we're being affected, we're here understanding that it's our health being affected, our financial security being affected, right? our cultural community practices. So much is happening here. And the thing is, we're not just talking about the loss of jobs and ceremonies, even those are huge too, right? Because those are a part of our lives. But there's just so much that's going on. No one right now really has a firm handle of this pandemic, right? So it's basically upended so much of our lives, right? And one of the things it's upended is our mental health, right? How we've been struggling. And the word mental health is not a bad word, right? We're all fall in mental health spectrum in some way, right? Some days we have great days, some days we're not doing so well, right? So mental health is a spectrum. And so think about it. All of our mental health has been impacted in some way, right? Is there anyone here, like, let's see, by a show of hands, or you could put it in the chat, right? How many of us feel that our or someone close to us, our mental health has been impacted? I know I definitely feel that way, right? Does anyone else? Okay, thank you, Jennifer, right? And thank you so much for sharing, right? I'll thank you. Um, absolutely, right? We know that our mental health has definitely been impacted. Maybe we've been more stressed out. Maybe we've been struggling with sleeping and eating and being able to socialize like we used to, or being able to enjoy the things we used to, right? So absolutely, here we're not just fighting a disease physically, we're fighting it mentally, right? And here's the thing, if your mental health has been impacted in any way, it is absolutely understandable. It is absolutely okay, right? In fact, it's expected, right? You're not alone in this. It's absolutely okay. It's okay to not be okay. We're going through so much right now, right? And in terms of going through so much, we need to acknowledge that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have definitely been affected disproportionately, differently, right? Here's the thing, um, this different effect, this disproportionate effect, has it only been happening during the pandemic? No, right? It's been historically happening, right? So thank you, Colin. Absolutely, it's been historically happening, right? However, the pandemic has made it a lot more evident. We want to recognize, we need to acknowledge that BIPOC communities have been impacted by deep rooted inequities in our systems of care, right? And these inequities, like we said, they've been evident throughout this entire pandemic, right? And so the thing is, we know this is about an hour, a little bit more than an hour, but still, we don't want the conversation to end here. We want this to be a conversation starter, which is why we will be focusing on like resilience tips and tools and how we can stay strong throughout this, right? And so again, in order to be able to actually do that, in order to be able to understand the disproportionate effect, we need to highlight how COVID-19 has exposed those disparities, right? Especially in terms of race, trauma, access to healthcare, right? In order to do that, we need to look at some statistics. So we're going to look at some statistics right now. And statistics are important because they're facts and they're numbers. And the thing about numbers is numbers tell a story, right? So we want to look at what that story is telling us. So let's go ahead and actually look at that story in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on New York City. So here we see some information from October 26th. So this is from a little over a month ago, right? But by the way, this information comes from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And if you want any updated information, like so current up-to-date information, Teresa's going to go ahead and put that link in the chat. And by the way, all of the resources that we share we're going to go ahead and email out to everyone. So you'll all have a copy of the resources. We're not allowed to share the slides, but the resources, don't worry, you will get them. All right. That's why it's so important that we go through attendance and everything. But take a look here, right? We see we see here in terms of total cases, hospitalizations, and deaths in New York City. Look at the numbers, right? We see that since October 26th, there have been over 252,000 cases, over 58,000 hospitalizations, over 19,000 confirmed deaths, and over 4,600 probable deaths. When they say probable deaths, they're saying that they reported that the cause of death was COVID-19, but they didn't actually have a positive laboratory test, so they based it on the signs and symptoms that that person was presenting, right? And so when we look at these, right, here's the thing, I'm here reading out numbers and everything, but remember, numbers tell a story. So what's happening here? What's the story? We know that these aren't just random individuals. These aren't just numbers, right? These are actual people, actual New Yorkers, actual loved ones, people we love and care about, people we may have passed by and seen and now no longer see anymore. Right? Family, friends, neighbors, our baristas, our people we pass by on the street, at the grocery store, at the bodega, right? Maybe our children's friends, And so these are real people who are impacted, right? And when we want to dive a little bit further to understand a little bit more about what's going on, well, let me ask you, what communities were most impacted, right? So go ahead, put it in the chat or even unmute yourself. Which communities do you think were the most impacted? Let me give a few seconds. Which communities do you think had the most cases, hospitalizations, and confirmed deaths? Anyone want to guess? Or take an educated guess?
BIPOC.
BIPOC communities, right? And so let's actually see, right? So here we're breaking it down. And so here we see, right? Take a look. So look here, we see a trend here where for both for all three cases, hospitalizations and deaths, look at the gray and yellow bars, right? We see Hispanic Latinx communities and the Black African American communities, right? With the highest in all three. However, before I go a little bit further into that, take a look at the blue bar, right? The blue bar represents Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And even though we see that they have the lowest number of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, this tends to make us think that there was very little impact or no impact on their community. But we know that's not true, right? We know that the Asian Pacific Islander community, they have been dealing with a lot of negative sentiment, anti-Asian sentiment, a lot of stigma, an increase in hate crimes, right? So much going on. So their impact was in a different way, right? And so, but we do need to acknowledge that they definitely have been impacted, right? However, when we look at cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, we do need to acknowledge that the communities that were most impacted are Latinx and Black communities, right? So we see that. And so let's try to understand, well, what does that mean, right? If we're talking about Latinx and Black communities, let's actually try to dive even further. Where are they, right? Where are they living? Out of the 5 boroughs of New York City, which 3 boroughs do you think had the highest number of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths? Go ahead and put it in the chat or unmute yourself.
Brooklyn.
Okay, so I heard someone say Brooklyn. Brooklyn is definitely one of them. Brooklyn's actually number 3. What about number 1 and 2?
Queens.
Queens is number 2. All right.
Harlem.
Bronx. I heard someone say Bronx. So Jennifer, there we go. So Bronx is number 1, and then Queens, and then Brooklyn, right? And so definitely. And what do we know? We know that they're the boroughs with the most loss of lives. But what else do we know? We know that they're the boroughs with the highest concentrations of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in New York City. So this makes us wonder right now, if the virus, when it affects our bodies, right? If it affects us equally, because we all have the same respiratory system, say for those, except for those who have, any respiratory illnesses or lung diseases and such, right? If the rest of us, if we have the same systems, why are some communities feeling the effect of COVID-19 more than others? Why are we seeing higher numbers in these communities, right? Basically, the story that this is showing us, the data highlights right here that the consequences of systemic inequities have historically affected BIPOC communities, right? So we want to actually spend some time focusing on those disparities and those inequities that BIPOC communities have been facing for a long time, right? So let's actually go ahead and take a look. We just saw that where we live can impact not just the quantity, but even the quality of resources, right, that are available to us. So that could mean, quality healthcare, right? Can I even get it at all? Is there quality healthcare within my neighborhood? Or do I have to take 2 trains and 3 buses to get there, right? Is it even affordable? What about nutritious food, right? Is there healthy, affordable food within the community? Or is it cheaper to buy maybe fast food, processed food, and make sure that the family is actually being fed, right? Because I remember almost my eyes getting wide when I saw that organic milk cost $10, right? It's expensive to get healthy food, right? What about even when we talk about nutritious foods, we know especially with the pandemic has actually put even more limitations and struggles in place, right? Because for many BIPOC communities, the children, school was the place where they got 1 to 2 meals a day. And now that's an added burden on top of all these other conditions that BIPOC communities are already facing. What about adequate housing? Is it safe? economic stability. What about the ability to even be able to physically distance or isolate ourselves, right? We know, especially for many essential workers, maybe where we're working in small spaces, where there isn't a backyard or a space to go to have a walk, where we're not going to be, meeting or seeing other people, right? What about buildings, or for many of them living in buildings where there's only one or two working elevators, right? And barely working elevators. So then what happens, right? And like we said, for essential workers, what about the loved ones who are out working in the outside working? And then when they come back, do they have the space to quarantine? Do they have the space to physically distance from their loved ones? Or is there that fear that we're bringing something back to our loved ones? Right? So there's always so much happening, so much going on, so much fear, right? We know that communities with limited access to resources face greater health disparities. And as a result of these disparities, they can also face, experience higher rates of mental struggles, even mental illness, right? Because think about it, we said all of our mental health, all of us, our mental health has been impacted in some way, right? And we have to acknowledge that these disparities, they've created this foundation that have led BIPOC communities to experience various types of trauma in turn, right? And let's think about it. When we're talking about trauma, when we say someone's been traumatized, we're saying that they've sustained a psychological injury or even a psychological wound to the mind, right? And this could be after experiencing a terrible event or a series of events, right? And so trauma, so we understand physical trauma, right? Something that's tangible, something we when we get hurt, right? Physically, right? But trauma can also be emotional. It can be mental, right? But there's a difference when it comes to supporting someone who has a physical injury versus someone who's going through an emotional injury, right? For example, think about this. Imagine I sprained my ankle or I broke my leg, right? And I'm hurt, I'm in bed, I can't get up. My home is a mess. I haven't even been able to pay the bills or go to work, right? Would you come over to my home and tell me, Sharifa, this place is disgusting. What's going on? I can't keep doing everything for you. You need to just walk it off. Get over it. Everyone gets hurt sometimes. Would you say that? Hopefully not, right? I see some of you shaking your head. Thank you, right? It's ridiculous. Instead, you might say, hey, it's okay, it's okay. You stay there. I'll bring you some food, water. I'll help take care of this for you. I'll clean up a little bit for you. You take the time you need to heal. You would tell me to take the time I need to heal. You would be very supportive, right? In most cases. However, when we're talking about a psychological injury, that psychological trauma, oftentimes we don't see that same support, right? Think about this pandemic, right? That same person who maybe they didn't break their leg, but instead, with all the stress, with everything going on, right? With so many unknown factors, maybe we're struggling to get out of bed. Maybe we're so stressed, our memory and concentration has been impacted. Oh, I was supposed to do that for work. I completely forgot. Oh, I was I supposed to pay the bill? Did I pay the bill this month? I'm not sure, right? Maybe we're walking into a room and wait, what was that? Why did I come in here? I can't remember, right? So much happening. And then for that person, instead of being supportive and telling them the same thing, hey, you take the time you need to heal. I'm here for you. Instead of telling them that, hey, come on, we're all going through this. Deal with it. Walk it off. You got to get to work. Those bills got to be paid. That's what we usually say, right? And it's not fair because, like we saw, trauma affects us all, right? And trauma is real. And even if it's not traumatizing to me, it could be traumatizing to you. And I need to be supportive of that, right? Trauma may not look the same for every person. Even two people in the exact same car crash can have a different experience. But just because one doesn't feel maybe one person, they're able to walk it off and go driving the next day and the other person is not, doesn't mean they can tell the other person, hey, I got over it. Why can't you? Right? Trauma is real. And we want to understand that, right? And so let's try to understand that also. In order to help us understand that a little bit more, we want to go ahead and dive into the different types of trauma, right? So the stressful events can actually cause any of these types of trauma or even a collection of these types of trauma, right? So a combination of them. So acute trauma. Acute trauma is when we have a direct impact on us physically or emotionally. So COVID-19 is an example, right? So our health being impacted physically or emotionally. Another example is discrimination, right? If someone is being discriminated because of their ethnicity, of their sexual orientation, right? That's acute trauma. What about collective trauma? In collective trauma, we're talking about an entire group of people being affected, right? An entire group of people feeling that pain, that mutual loss together, right? That uneasiness together. Can anyone think of an example of collective trauma? You can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself. Can we think of an example?
Floyd, the death of Floyd, George Floyd.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Definitely. And the death of George Floyd, not only is that collective trauma, that can also go into secondary traumatic stress, right? Where here someone else's firsthand trauma can be traumatizing to us, right? And collective trauma, that is trauma that's collective for the entire Black community. Absolutely, right? And we're going to talk about this as well when we talk about trauma within BIPOC communities, where even just trauma that so sometimes when we constantly see people who look like us, people who are similar to us, when they're being brutalized, how that can impact us as well. So absolutely, right? So yes. What about 9/11? Every September 11 comes and we collectively feel that trauma together. COVID-19, this pandemic is collective trauma, right? Because we all feeling this loss and uneasiness together. So secondary traumatic stress, we just dived into it a little bit. It's not necessarily directly. It could be that we witness someone else's trauma, hear about it. It doesn't even have to be in person. It could be through media, newspapers, right? It's very traumatizing to hear or see someone else get traumatized, right? That could be even like I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, living in a neighborhood with a lot of sirens can be very traumatizing, right? So absolutely, I know my sister lives right next to the hospital, and for her, it's very scary to constantly see through the windows the red lights and the sirens all the time, right? Living in a neighborhood where maybe someone got shot, right? So absolutely. So and the emotional stress that results, this is collective trauma. I mean, so secondary traumatic stress, right? And so this is also known as vicarious trauma, right? What about traumatic separation? So this is sudden and unexpected separation, right? Families and loved ones being suddenly and unexpectedly separated. It's not like when someone is going off to college because that's planned, right? That's something that you've been working towards and planning. It's sudden separation, right? So can anyone give an example of traumatic separation? Think about maybe things that are going on now, even in the past.
Family members going to hospitals and nobody can be with them.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. Right, loved ones who are at the hospital, and here that can even lead to a lot of guilt, right? What if this is the last time I see them? And here maybe we're looking for a healthcare worker to put get a phone to our loved one, right? It's very very traumatic, right? Even when we've seen a lot of elderly, a lot of people with immunocompromised systems where they can't be with the rest of the family, right? That's very traumatic, right? So absolutely. Even when we talk about mothers who just tested positive for COVID-19 and now their newborn baby is taken away from her. That's very traumatic for mommy. Can that be traumatic for the baby as well? Yeah, absolutely. Right? And a lot of times we don't realize this, but even newborn babies, they not only understand, but they feel trauma. They really do get it. That's why that early developmental skin to skin contact is even so important, right? So, what about families who are separated in detention centers, right? Families who are ripped apart at the border. So, absolutely very traumatic, right? And all of these types of trauma can go hand in hand with traumatic grief. Because in traumatic grief, which is an abrupt, unexpected loss, we're not just mourning the loss, we're traumatized by that loss, right? Whereas maybe a person is not really able to fully process it yet. And that in itself can be very traumatizing. Think about everything that's been going on. For many of us, with the grief that we've been experiencing, we may not even realize that we're grieving because we're probably still trying to process that grief, right? And with that, like we just said, if, or not being able to see someone at the hospital, right? Wondering if that's the last time we're going to be able to say goodbye, right? There can be a lot of guilt, a lot of survivor's guilt. Why did I make it and someone else didn't? A lot of if onlys, if only I had been there, if only I had done this, if only I had made sure that they didn't, and so much of it, right? We start blaming ourselves, we start putting so much on ourselves, But we want to emphasize, please understand that so much has happened in this pandemic, so much of our control has been taken away. Please understand it is not your fault. There's only so much we've been able to do, right? And we also want to acknowledge we don't know what you've gone through, right? We want to encourage you to honor where you're at right now, wherever that is, all right? If you need to take a break, that's absolutely okay. However, you're processing, we want to recognize that you're doing the best that you can, all right? And that's important because we're all coming from a place where we're under a lot of stress and pain. So it's important that we give each other a little bit of slack right now, right? And if you need to take a break, I completely understand. If your mental health has been impacted, that is completely understandable, right? Our bodies are working through a lot of stressors right now, right? And this is a little bit heavy. So thank you all so much for being here. Hey, how is everyone doing? Because I know this is a little bit heavy. Are we okay? Can I get a thumbs up or let me know in the chat? Are we doing okay? All right, thank you. I see a couple of thumbs up. Thank you. So yeah, so let's go ahead and we want to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. And as we're taking care of ourselves, as we're talking about all of this, right? And especially if we're talking about trauma and we were talking about BIPOC communities, well, here's the thing. Beyond the types of trauma that we talked about, we know that people in BIPOC communities have also experienced have experiences of trauma that is a bit more specific, right? Right? Particularly when we talk about historical trauma. And historical trauma, which is also known as generational trauma, we have to understand that some communities have faced trauma over and over and over again. Earlier, we mentioned slavery, redlining, Jim Crow, right? And so, and historical trauma, to understand historical trauma a little bit more, historical trauma is real. Historical trauma is something that passes down from generation to generation. That trauma is real because trauma literally lives on in our DNA, in our bodies, and it literally genetically passes down to our children. So some of the trauma that any of us may be experiencing now may have even been from generational trauma from the generations before us, right? The things that we're experiencing. And that historical trauma is constantly being upheld by things like systemic racism, fear of deportation, and racial profiling and excessive police force. So let's help us understand that a little bit more, right? How is systemic racism doing that? Well, systemic racism has roots in historical trauma, right? So we're not necessarily talking about when someone is discriminated in a store and told to leave, although that could be an effect of historical trauma, but we're talking more systemic like healthcare, education, policies and practices that are there to exclude certain communities and keep upholding that systemic racism, right? Even how wealth has been distributed is not equal, right? And there's similar patterns in our healthcare as we've definitely been seeing throughout this pandemic, right? So the thing about systemic racism, understand also like this. I know this is how someone explained it to me, and I really loved it. They said if we were to remove every racist person from our politics, our policies, our educational structures, our cultural structures, and so on, right? Even if we were to remove every racist person, it wouldn't entirely make a difference because it's the system itself that is racist. It's the system itself that needs to be changed, right? It's the system itself that makes it so difficult to for many BIPOC communities to get ahead in anything, right? Even like we said, our educational systems, how wealth is distributed. Even think about zip codes. If any of you are ever interested, go ahead and look at a map and look at how zip codes look. We would think that maybe we would make it like bars and graphs and stuff. No, it's not. Instead, the zip codes, it can look like it goes around. One zip code may go around another neighborhood and circle around it, and it looks very wonky and weird. And there's a reason for that. Zip codes and I think I'm trying to remember what the gerrymandering, right? The way they're made is that so the in the zip code, the majority of the community stays a certain community, right? And we know that's often non-BIPOC communities. So that when it comes to voting, when it comes to politics and such, they have the majority of representation, and that's oftentimes what happens. And so it doesn't really make sense because you'll see BIPOC communities, like I've seen even in my community, right? I'm at the corner, or I'll walk a little bit further, and there's like 3 or 4 different zip codes in that area, and it doesn't make sense. Why is one neighborhood being broken up into so many different neighborhoods? Well, if you're no longer the majority of that neighborhood, then you don't really get as much representation. And so that in itself is systemic racism, right? So many policies need to be changed, right? So absolutely. And also, and I can go into dive into this forever, but wait, let's also talk about fear of deportation. We just talked about traumatic separation, right? For someone where there's that constant fear, whether for themselves or for a loved one, well, when they need support, right? When they need any medical attention, mental health assistance, even governmental assistance, or any type of assistance that even they are entitled to, most likely they won't get that help, right? Even planning a future can be so scary, right? Even when we're talking about and also with that fear, right? That prolonged exposure to that fear, the body is going to register that as trauma. And like we said, trauma registers in our DNA, and that is genetically passed down to our children, right? All of this is real. It can be scarring, it can be terrifying, right? And lastly, when we're talking about racial profiling and excessive police force, we're not going on a spiel to say that all police are bad, but we have to acknowledge that the occurrences of racial profiling, it often leads to more police contact with BIPOC communities. And these encounters, whether we experience them firsthand or through constant violent imagery, right, on our media, on our news, social media, even, right, that can reinforce and further trigger existing and historical trauma, right? So it's really important to understand that. And what do we mean by it's reinforcing? Think about it. Earlier we were talking about how constantly seeing communities who look like us or similar communities who are on the news constantly being brutalized, killed, right? Hurt in front of us. What is that doing? Why is that even happening? Why are we constantly being shown these violent images? Oftentimes there's a reason for that in the media. That is often even meant to desensitize us, to make us think that we're supposed to expect Black and brown communities to be brutalized. And that's not okay, right? So it's absolutely not okay. And so we want to go ahead and we want to try to work on that. And again, this goes into the whole systemic racism part where we need to fix the whole system itself, right? So with that, I know that was a lot. I definitely know that was a lot. So let me go ahead and do another check-in. Give me a thumbs up if you're okay. I know that's a lot. All right, I see a few thumbs up. I hope we're all doing okay. I know it's heavy, but also to help us understand all of this and to help us like really thank you for those giving me a thumbs up, right? And saying in the chat, right? So we also know that in addition to historical forms of trauma, BIPOC communities, whenever they've tried to get help, they've also encountered a lot of barriers to seeking mental health treatment, right? To help them address some of these traumas, right? So question for all of you. What are some things that could prevent people in the BIPOC communities from accessing support, right? Mental health support that could actually help them process these traumas and help them heal. What could stop them from doing that, right? Because it's so go ahead, put it in the chat. You could unmute yourself if you want, right? So what are some, Colin mentioned fear, right? So absolutely, there's definitely a fear when it comes to getting support, right? It's interesting because oftentimes when we talk about mental health struggles, people usually say, well, if you're so stressed out, you should go to therapy. Like as if therapy is a cure-all for everything, right? As if you're gonna be fine right away, right? But we know it's not that simple. Fear is real. Fear of what's gonna happen when I go there, especially because we know for many communities of color, there is a legitimate reasoning for that fear. There's a history of why there's that fear, right? A history of mistrust within even the medical community, medical systems, and now on top of that, mental health, right? We know Tuskegee is a reality, right? Well, think about even when it comes to the advances and everything we have right now in gynecology, right? All of the advancements and everything we have were because of Black women who were forced, right? So we have to acknowledge that there is a reality for that fear. So I know a lot of times I've even heard many times people saying people who refuse or to see mental health treatment or people who don't believe in mental health treatment are stupid or something. No, that's not true. There is a reason for that fear. There's a reason why they don't believe in it because historically they were brutalized. So we have to acknowledge that, right? Yassine, you mentioned not knowing what's available. Absolutely. So many people talk about resources. Oh, you should go see this and that. Where are the resources? Because the resources are not in every community. right? And even if there are, you call, you try to make an appointment. Oh, yes, our next available appointment is in 2 or 3 months, right? That's so, it's such a struggle. Judy, you mentioned ashamed, right? And that goes along with stigma, right? There's so much stigma because of how are people going to treat me, what's going to happen, right? A lot of cultural stigma even, right? And so even on the provider's end, there's a lot of stigma, right? I mean, what if they're not culturally attuned? What if they say something insensitive like, "Oh, doesn't everyone in your community go through that?" Where I'm thinking like, "No, that's just me or my family. It's not that my whole community is problematic." Right? A lot of fear and stigma, so much going on in there. People can even be ridiculed for certain practices that can be completely normal in their community, right? So absolutely. Georgia, you mentioned insurance, immigration status. Ooh, big ones, right? Insurance is that one. What about money? How do I afford it? Where do I, and even if I do have the money, what about the copay? And it's not just one appointment, it's several appointments. How do we pay for this? And then on top of that, medication, right? So much going on, right? And so many of you mentioned all of these already. So, stigma, huge one, right? And there's a lot happening here. Lack of diversity amongst mental health care providers, lack of culturally competent providers, right? Language barriers. Language is so important because language can also mean like, are we making sure that we're getting the proper diagnosis even? Right? Understanding each other. If we don't understand each other, that's going to be really important, especially when we talk about mental health. I know, for example, in I speak Bengali as well. In my language, there is a word called dukho, and dukho, if I directly translate it to English, it means pain or emotional pain. And thing is, even though that's the direct translation, in my language, it means a lot more than that. And I need another Bengali provider, someone who's Bengali also, to be able to really fully understand that, right? Same thing for other languages as well. Language barriers are huge and again can go into misdiagnosis, right? There's discrimination. Even think about time. Time is a privilege. Time is money, right? Right? Many of us have to work. Many of us have families to take care of, right? And that's so important. And so we have to understand that that's a huge deal, right? What about denial? Right? Denial of, and that could go along with fear, as we mentioned earlier. Being vulnerable and accepting your reality can also be really challenging, right? I'd rather pretend that this isn't a problem because I can't solve it, right? It's not something visible. You look fine, right? It can be very difficult. And when we think about COVID-19 and everything, we know it's also even opened up another barrier, teletherapy. Teletherapy can be really great, right? Being able to have therapy at home through our screens and such. But even if we have insurance money, even if we have, culturally competent providers and everything, even if we have all those other things, what about space, right? What if we're at home? What if we can't talk about those things because home is where it's not safe and we can't leave our home to talk about it, right? With all of everyone else around, right? So again, many barriers, right? So very important to understand that. But here's the thing, we don't want to just leave it at barriers. It's very important to understand, like, so we want to go ahead and share some really amazing resources with all of you. And so here are some great resources that we have seen. So I know it's already 5:43, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit here. So I'm going to go ahead and actually share some of these great resources with you. So here, this is the first one we want to share is inclusive therapist. Ooh, I don't know why it's in right now. It's in. Let me see if I can. Here we go. So Inclusive Therapist is a wonderful resource. And so what's great about it is that it's this national directory of ethnically inclusive clinicians and diverse clinicians. And what's so great about it is that you can search through many different options, right? You can look up if someone has the cultural knowledge you're seeking for, insurance, what language they speak, right? Even spiritual knowledge, therapeutic approach, therapeutic identity. So important to have all of these. And not only that, but you can look at different types of therapies, individual, marriage or relationship, family, therapy for children, for adolescents, group therapy, right? My favorite thing about this website though is the fact that you can actually change the language and it can be they have over 75 languages and dialects. So some really great things here. And you can see whichever one I choose. So I'm gonna pick Bengali because that's where I'm from. The entire website will change. And for many people, that can be really, really great. So I don't know why from here, but usually it changes the entire one. And then you can go back to the original, right? So that's also a really great website. Another really great website is the Black Mental Health Alliance, right? So the Black Mental Health Alliance is a wonderful website. It is mostly for Black mental health professionals. They're providing culturally relevant and educational forums and trainings, some really great support, right? And not only that, but the things, even though they're mostly for Black mental health professionals, they are also have information for the community itself, right? So it's a really great resource. And they have a lot of culturally competent and patient-centered therapists and psychiatrists, right? So some really great ones that you can search by the preference that you have. Right? Another really great resource is Latinx therapists. By the way, thank you, Teresa, because she's already gone ahead and put up this information in the chat. And don't forget, we will be emailing all of this out to you. So Latinx therapy is also a really great resource because Latinx therapy, you'll if you know maybe whether it applies to you or for someone you may know, it's really great because not only can you research a therapist by all the ones that we talked about earlier, right? Like someone who's culturally competent, someone who's the same cultural identity, but they also have podcasts in English and Spanish. They have a lot of resources for a lot of Latinx professionals. They have bilingual mental health, books in English and Spanish for adults as well as children, right? So some really great things. And also they have apps in Spanish, right? And the last one we want to share right for now is the Asian Mental Health Collective, which is also a really great resource. So I know we talked about stigma. I'm from the South Asian community, and I can definitely say, and I'm sure this is for many communities, there is so much stigma in the Asian community, right? And so with that, the Asian Mental Health Directive Collective, what they're doing is they're trying to destigmatize mental illness and actually increase access to care. Actually create safe spaces for Asian Americans to discuss the impact of mental health in their community. So they have a lot of online forums, in-person meetup groups, mental health podcasts. So a lot of really great things here, right? So it's really important to check those out. And again, we're getting all of those resources emailed out to you at the very end. So we've talked about all of these Latinx therapy. And so since we've been talking about some mental health resources, let's talk about how our mental health has been impacted, right? And so, like we said earlier, all of us, our mental health has been impacted in some way, right? Whether maybe we've been feeling more anxious, maybe we've been feeling more depressed, maybe we're more stressed out, and some people may have been turning to substances like alcohol more, right? And then we also know that individuals who were vulnerable to domestic violence, that vulnerability has increased with staying at home, not being able to go out for work, right? And not only that, but even think about children, right? Because we know domestic violence it does go to children as well, right? It can be child neglect, right? And child, so much happening here. If you know anyone who is vulnerable to domestic violence, we have the New York City Hope Line, which Teresa is sharing. We also have some more domestic violence resources that we'll be emailing out. And so it's really important. And by the way, if their life is in danger, though, if someone's life is in danger, that's a 911 call, however. But it's important if it's not someone's life isn't threatened immediately, the New York City Hope Line is a great resource. Now, I know I mentioned 911, right, for emergencies and such. We do have to acknowledge that, especially for BIPOC communities, a 911 call can sometimes be really terrifying, right? Because calling 911 is not always the safest option for BIPOC communities. So if you do call 911 for anything outside of like medical emergencies and such, please do let them know exactly what's going on. If it's a mental health emergency, let them know it's a mental health emergency. Let them know that you need a mental health professional, right? And especially starting in February, they have they're in New York City, they're like sending out a whole team. When you call 911, they're going to send a mental health professional instead of a police officer, right? So it's really important. Or maybe with they're still working on that. I know it's a pilot program, but it's so important that they're doing this, right? So let them know you need a mental health professional. You are entitled to ask for someone with CIT, crisis intervention training. You are allowed to ask for an officer who is plain clothes, because sometimes just the uniform can escalate the situation, right? It doesn't always mean that that's what's going to happen, because depending on the emergency of the situation, how fast they can get there and such, that's going to depend as well, those factors. But it is important to still ask, right? Because again, like we said, for many BIPOC communities, calling 911 can be terrifying, right? Some other things we also want to look at when it comes to our mental health is how about our daily functioning? How have we been able to function the way we've always been able to, right? That's important to look at because oftentimes if I was to ask someone, as especially within my community, right? How's your mental health? Have you been dealing with any anxiety or depression? Usually the answer is, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not crazy. You're crazy. What do you mean mental health? Right? So it's about changing our wording often. It's also about looking at our daily functioning. Have we been able to live, love, laugh, and learn as we used to? Live our lives the way that we want to. That means sleeping, eating, going to work, doing our daily things, right? Laughing, meaning doing things that we genuinely enjoy, whether it's music or food or activities and such, right? Love means to, love and appreciate and care for the people around us, but most importantly, love ourselves, right? Learning is it's not just memory and concentration. It's not just learning new things, but it's also building memories, right? So that's important. Have we been able to do these? If not, maybe our mental health has been impacted. And it's important to look at even the small things that we may not realize, right? So, for example, this is going to sound silly, but it's true. I know for me, one of the things I absolutely used to love doing before the pandemic was washing the dishes. I generally don't like to clean. I don't like cleaning anything. It's just the dishes, right? And so I know even whenever I went over to my parents' homes or my friends' homes, I would literally start washing their dishes, right? And so it's made me happy. But something I noticed, right, throughout this pandemic, throughout these past few months, even right now, the dishes in the sink just keep piling up. And at first I told myself, well, everyone lets their dishes pile up, right? But then I had to also tell myself, that's something I used to love. So maybe something's going on, right? So even the little things, the things we used to enjoy, it's important to look at that, right? To look through that, especially because when we talk about, our mental health, when we talk about anxiety and depression, especially when we talk about it, breaking it down by race and ethnicity, right? Take a look. We see here that individuals who identify with as multiple races or Latinx or Black communities, we see some of the highest rates of anxiety and depression, right? But here's the thing. Looking at this graph, I know, and I'm sure we can all say these numbers are not accurate, right? I'm sure we can all look at this and say, these numbers are probably too low. In reality, it should probably be a lot higher, right? Because I know from being from the Asian community, when I look at the numbers for the Asian community, I look at that, I'm like, no, I know the numbers should definitely be a lot higher. So what's happening? Well, oftentimes, like we said earlier, you ask someone, hey, are you living with depression or anxiety? Are you struggling with your mental health? What do you mean? I'm not crazy. You're crazy, right? There's that defensiveness, there's that denial, right? Also, it may not always be denial. For many people, they may not even know that they're living with anxiety or depression because anxiety and depression can look different in different communities, right? In one community, being quiet, keeping to yourself can look like depression. In another community, that might just be the norm, right? So it's so important that we talk about daily functioning. Have you been sleeping? How have you been eating? Right? Because that question, hey, how are you? Are you doing okay? Those people will usually, yeah, I'm fine. I'm okay. But how have you been sleeping? Have you still been able to do the things you enjoy? Like things like that. That can help us dive a little bit further into how someone is coping, right? And to help us understand that a little bit more, we also need to understand where the anxiety and depression is coming from, right? We see, take a look here. We see that, this actually surprised me too, right here, where we see that the majority of it is coming from isolation and loneliness. We might think that we're strong, independent beings, but here's the thing, isolation and loneliness affects us. We are social beings, right? I'm an introvert, and even as an introvert, I normally like to stay home, keep to myself, hang out with myself. But these past few months, I have been craving human interaction. I don't know why, but I've just been wanting to go outside and even say hi to random people because we are social beings, right? I mean, there's also COVID-19 concerns and also grief and loss. Take a look at that last bar, grief and loss. We see here that even though it's the last bar, I mean, it's the lowest bar for both anxiety and depression, it might be really low because for many people, they still haven't been able to fully process that grief and loss, right? Like we talked about earlier with traumatic grief. So let's try to understand it a little bit more, right? How has COVID-19 impacted our ability to mourn or deal with loss? So we also want to remember that it's grief is a completely natural reaction to loss, right? And we can grieve for things individually, we can grieve for things as a community, We can grieve for losing a loved one, someone close to us. We can even grieve for things that are important to us, right? It could be not being able to celebrate together, not being able to be at a funeral together, not being able to just spend time together, go out for coffee together. And if we think about it, many times when we spent time with each other, we weren't necessarily always even talking together. Maybe it was just sitting in the same space together that was very calming, that was very comforting, and we haven't been able to do that. Even a hug, right? And the thing about grief is that we grieve for people differently, not only individually, but even among different cultures, right? So that's important to understand because even that's been affected, right? The way we are able to grieve has been changed. So preventing visits to hospitals, disrupting funeral arrangements, reducing memorial services, affecting mourning rituals. We all grieve differently. But the thing is, one thing that many cultures and communities generally have in common is that usually when it comes to grieving, it takes people coming together, right? Praying together, visiting each other, eating food together. Like I said, sometimes just sitting in the same space, hugging each other, right? So that in itself could have even added to the grief. And we also know that when it comes to grieving, hey, technology is a privilege, right? Not having access to technology and to virtual funerals and group therapy and such, not everyone is privileged enough to have that, right? So in a way, I'm grateful for the fact that technology is here and that this is happening in a year, 2020, where we're able to connect virtually. But we also need to acknowledge not everyone has access to that, so that could have isolated people even more. So what we see here is these limitations and restrictions, they've taken an isolated experience and possibly made it even worse. Right? So what do we do? How do we help that person? How do we help ourselves who are still struggling with this, right? This is where we really want to talk about resilience. So we were going to move to a conversation about resilience, but a couple of things to keep in mind, right? When we talk about it, uh, we have to acknowledge a candlelit bubble bath is not going to solve systemic racism, okay? But it's still important to take care of ourselves, right? Especially while we're fighting the bigger fight, right? We want to make sure that we're sustainable on our day to day. And whatever we talked about today, which we know is a lot, right? It's just a conversation starter. We've barely scratched the surface, and none of what I say is to be dismissive of the bigger traumas that many communities are facing, right? But we still need to talk about how we can take care of ourselves, right? Especially on a daily basis, and how we can be there for each other, right? That's why we want to really talk about resilience. And that word resilience, you've heard us use a lot, right? The ability to bounce forward. I know it says bounce back. We're going into a new world. We're learning to adapt to adversity. And the thing is, resilience is our bodies and our mind working through stress and recovering so that the next time it happens, we're better equipped and maybe we can help others as well, right? So there's some things that can help us through resilience. So acceptance. Acceptance is, I know it sounds straightforward, but it is hard, right? Here we're accepting the reality that we may not be able to see our family and friends for a while, or go out for a while, or do many things that we used to be able to do, right? Or maybe even for a longer amount of time. Managing expectations, by the way, that's managing expectations of not only others, but of ourselves as well. Recognizing our limitations. And it's recognizing that we might not be able to do the things that we used to be able to do. And that's absolutely okay. I know I used to be able to multitask and do a million different things, and now I feel tired all the time, right? Now I'm snacking all the time, right? Sleeping all the time. And that's okay. It took me a long time to tell myself, hey, you know what? That's okay. Even for many of, I know for me, I put on the quarantine 15, and it took me some time to say that's okay, right? Because we're all adapting to a new world, right? We're dealing with so many stressors, the pandemic, our finances, being cooped up inside with the same people, right? That, yes, being cooped up inside can also be very stressful, right? And so I'm sure I see some of you start smiling a little bit. I think we all get it, right? I know before the pandemic, my husband and I barely found time to be with each other because of our work schedules. And now we see each other all the time. It's a little bit stressful, but yeah, right? Maintaining social connections is so important. I know a lot of people have been using the term social distancing. We do not need to social distance. I don't like that term because we need to physically distance. But socially, we still need to stay connected with each other. Socially, we still need to be there for each other, right? Practicing mindfulness, spirituality. I love how before we joined, there was a sermon and everyone being together, right? And talking about what's important to you. For many people, that's the three F's: family, friends, and faith. right? So important. Mindfulness can also be breathing exercises, meditation, what works for you. Being compassionate to yourself and others. Please be kind to yourself first. The way we help others, right? The best way to not be selfish is to take care of ourselves. Because how can we take care of others when we're hurting ourselves? How can we make sure that, we're basically, what I'm trying to say is, you can't pour from an empty cup, right? You have to give what's overflowing from that cup, because otherwise, if we're not taking care of ourselves, we might say things that are not so helpful, right? And I understand that it's almost 6. If you can bear with me, we have about 5-7 minutes left in the presentation. So here we are, right? Sometimes we may say things that are a little bit minimizing. So things like, everything will be fine, they're in a better place, everything happens for a reason, time heals all wounds. And for some people, this can be comforting, that's okay. But for the majority of people, that can be very minimizing, very trivializing, right? So instead, we need to pay attention to what the griever needs, what they need, what's important to them. This is where listening really comes in, right? A lot of times, remember earlier we said live, love, laugh, and learn. There's also sort of a fifth one, listening, right? And most people are not listening to listen. Most people are listening to respond. We already have a response ready in our head before the person is even finished speaking. This is where we really need to stop doing that, right? This is where we need to tell ourselves we need to shut up and listen, right? Here, maybe say, I'd love to hear more about your loved one whenever you're ready, but I also respect your privacy. This is where we need to show empathy, not sympathy. Sympathy is that pity party. Empathy is really acknowledging and showing that we're aware of the loss. We're aware that this is a difficult time, and we're letting them know that we're here to support them and help them as they need. We need to acknowledge that grief is a process. It's a different process for everyone, and everyone might be in a different stage. Even siblings who lose the same parent might be in a different place. One of them, weeks later, they might be doing okay, whereas the other one, months later, they're still struggling, and that's okay, right? But we need to check in on them constantly, let them know it's absolutely normal to have these ups and downs. It's absolutely okay that some days you might seem fine and other days are really challenging, right? But we're here to support them. We're here to respect all of that, right? And and sometimes that means being non-judgmental, even when they're engaging in unhealthy coping strategies. But we're going to be there to help them through that, right? So when we say unhealthy coping strategies, we're talking about excess, right? Things that are overdoing things, right? So overexposure to media. I'm sure we've all done this, where maybe we're constantly checking the news, constantly checking what's going on, what's happening, what's going on with COVID, is this happening, what's going on with the elections, what's going on with, right? So much, and we're constantly overexposing ourselves. That can lead to a lot of vicarious trauma, and that can consume our thoughts. So it's important sometimes to put that phone down, turn off the TV, right? Misuse of alcohol or other substances. Now, maybe that one, glass of wine all of a sudden turns to the whole bottle, right? And no judging, nothing like that. That's not what we're saying. We just want to look at what about your daily functioning, right? The ability to live, love, laugh, and learn. Has that been impacted, right? Unnecessary spending. Who here has done this with me, right? The retail therapy, right? The constant shopping, constantly getting packages in the mail, right? Getting like packages in the mail can be very therapeutic. That's why they say it's retail therapy, right? I always say that retail therapy should be covered by insurance, right? But I'm right. And so all that unnecessary spending, right? It's that we're buying habitually just for the sake of spending money for things that we may not actually need. And then we feel the effect of it later, right? There needs to be a balance, right? And also risky and destructive behaviors. For some people, that looks like self-harm. For others, that can look like things like ignoring necessary safety precautions, not wearing a mask, not physically distancing, right? And that in a turn not only creates a high risk to themselves, but also can endanger others. And usually there's this mentality, everything already sucks. What's the point? Everything's already horrible. Why bother? Right? So instead, we want to hopefully engage in some healthy activities and to help them replace those unhealthy coping strategies with some helpful ones. So this is where we need some help from all of you, right? What are some of the things that you've been doing for self-care? Go ahead and put it in the chat, right? Because for me, it's been snacking and I need to stop, right? But either way, we need some new self-care strategies. What are some things that you've been doing to take care of you, right? And self-care, it doesn't have to even be fancy, right? If it's great if it is, but it doesn't have to be fancy. For some of us, that's taking a hot shower, sleeping, taking care of our body, right? Taking care of our body, self-monitoring, that's self-care, right? So what are some of the things that you've been doing? So you can even unmute yourself. You can put it in the chat. I want to hear from you. What are some of the things that you've been doing? I want to hear from at least one or two people.
Walking more.
I love it. Walking more. So great. And we see that it feels so good, especially when we go out in the sun, right? Sunlight is directly related to our energy, right? Colin, you mentioned chiropractic care. Oh, I've been wanting to do this for so I've been wanting to go to a chiropractor. I love it. Jeanette, you mentioned reading. Yes. I've been going back to reading as well. I love that, right? So great that all of us are doing this, staying connected with our support systems, right? Getting sunlight, self-help books. For many people, like we said, faith-based support systems are communities, right? Are the three F's: family, friends, and faith, right? You're seeing, you mentioned reading, exercising, listening to music. I always wait for someone to mention music, but still, I love it. Getting lots of fresh air. We need that because we're cooped up inside with the same air being recycled over and over again, right? Daryl, exercise. Yes. Singing. Oh, I love it. Yes.
Permission to speak.
Oh, could you repeat that? I couldn't hear that.
Yes, I've been taking my blood pressure daily.
Yeah, even checking our body. I love that, right? Like we said, it's
Take my blood pressure daily, yes, and cut down on salt and trying to eat very healthy.
I'm working on that. I'm working on that. So I love that you're doing that,
Yes.
right? Because taking care of our body, like we said, self-monitoring is self-care, right? This is where we got to think about our
Yes.
4Ls, right? Our ability to live, love, laugh, and learn is so important. Oops, our ability to live, love, laugh, and learn is so important. When we notice that one of them is lacking, it's important to take time and effort to figure out what's going on, because that in itself is self-care. If you feel tired, listen to your body. Allow your body to feel it and process it, right? So important. So we've already mentioned a lot of these. Something I also want to mention, even thinking like time management, right? Things like writing letters to loved ones, prayer, praise, music. One of the most important things for when it comes to self-care though is setting clear boundaries, right? Anyone here struggle with saying no to loved ones? I know I do, right? You can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat. I know when it comes to saying no, I struggle a lot. I'm so glad you're saying no, right? You're saying no to me right now. I love it, right? But I know for many people, it can be really hard to say no to our loved ones, but it's so important to have those boundaries, especially because we're wiped out, we're tired. We need to take care of ourselves before we're able to help anyone else, right? Otherwise, we might be harmful to them. And the great thing about taking care of ourselves is that we can even use our technology to help us do that. So there are many apps that can help us do that. You can find it on the NYC Well app library. So Teresa's going to be sharing this. These are some of the apps that are out here for anxiety. There's Shine, Calm, and Ginger. Calm is one that's a little bit more popular. On them, they're about mindfulness. They have a lot of great meditation suggestions, music, sounds. I like to listen to the sound of rainfall sometimes. For depression, there's Wissa and Sanvelo and many others. So these are basically chatbots that use cognitive behavioral therapy tools and other tools like breathing exercises and stretching exercises and videos and chat groups and coaching to help someone. And all of these are evidence-based, so they're clinically validated, evidence-based, mobile apps. There's Restore and Sleepio. And if you check out the app library, you'll be able to find a lot more. So you'll be able to find for well-being, mindfulness, depression, anxiety, stress, substance use, pain, and you'll be able to find and who they're for as well. So it's a really great place to check out other apps, right? And the thing is, even though we can use all of these apps, we can use, self-care, sometimes we may see that it may not be enough, right? If you notice that your symptoms have been worsening over time, maybe you're struggling with sleeping, eating, working, socializing, doing things that you usually used to do, like washing the dishes, it's absolutely okay. All it means is maybe we need some extra professional help, right? Especially if we notice that it's leading to a mental health crisis like thoughts of suicide. That is a 911 call. That is an immediate help, right? But other times, take a look. What's happening? Have I been struggling for a while? Let's get some help. So let's talk about some of that help, right? There's a New York State COVID-19 emotional support helpline. They have free mental health counseling and information on how to get tested. There's NYC Well, which is an amazing resource that we absolutely love. They're also free, confidential 24/7, and they're in over 200 languages. What's also really great about them is that you can use any platform. You can call, you can text, you can chat. I'm from the generation that still likes to call. Everyone hates me for it, but I know a lot of people prefer to text, and that's understandable, right? What's also great is that they have a crisis team. And also, let's say you don't want to talk to a mental health professional. You can just go ahead and talk to someone who's not a mental health professional, but is a certified peer specialist. So someone who has a similar history. And so it feels very judgment free, right? So really great. Some other really great resources are the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Support Helpline. It's free, it's confidential, it's 24/7 for substance use and problem gambling. There's the Trevor Project, which is a really great resource for the LGBTQIA plus youth up to age 25, also free and confidential. And so this is some really great resources. But the last one we want to share with you, and we're a little biased because it is from the New York State Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So I absolutely love this resource. If you go on this website here, which we will be sharing with you, and Teresa is going ahead and sharing with you in the chat, you can look up, you put in any zip code, and you'll be able to find health services. So if you're looking for pharmacies and primary healthcare facilities, mutual aid if you're looking for groceries or prescription or translation assistance. They even have food services like food pantries, free grab and go meals, grocery stores. You can find community organizations that can help with financial stability and housing assistance. You'll be able to find resources for immigrant communities. And by the way, that's regardless of immigration status or even if the ability to pay, right? And that information is in multiple languages, right? And there's resources for the LGBTQIA plus communities, for if you're looking for mental health support, physical health support, food, housing, peer support, right? So a lot of resources here. And so with that, I know this was a lot, right? I know this was a lot. So let's recap everything. We know COVID-19 has definitely changed all of our lives. We know our mental health has been impacted, right? Whether we've been feeling more anxious, depressed, maybe we've been dealing with grief and still processing our grief. We talked about the systemic inequities that are prevalent, and we talked about why it's so important to prioritize and take care of our self-care, right? Take care of ourselves and stay resilient. And we shared some mental health resources that we hope are helpful to you. So to end, we want to share a little excerpt from Maya Angelou's poem Still I Rise. Now, the thing is, even though this poem was published in 1978, we're sharing this because we know these words still ring true today, right? Maya Angelou is an amazing woman. She faced racism and sexism, and these are her words. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. And with that, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to welcome back Teresa and everyone. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please let us know, right? So, and if there's any slides you want us to go back to, we can do that as well.
Very good, very good, very good.
Fantastic.
Very
Thank you
good.
so much, Sharifa. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I would like to thank everyone for being present for the presentation. As Sharifa mentioned, I do have a couple of questions for a couple of folks. However, if you have questions pertaining to the presentation, please don't hesitate. This is your presentation today, and as I said in the very beginning, it's so important that you get what you need. Okay? So thank you for those of you who answered some of my chat questions. I do appreciate that immensely in a positive direction. So I thank everyone.
Thank you,
Okay.
Bill.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Cornerstone Seventh Adventist Church leadership, I'd like to say a very special thank you to you and Miss Happy for coming out and delivering such a timely information. This is information that we need because we need to know about the resources in our community. So thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Slowly. I also wanted to ask for individuals who may not have email or anything, we're going to send out the resources to everyone, including you. Would you prefer would you be able to send out the resources to those who don't have emails who are here?
Right, right.
Okay. Just once I receive the information,
Excellent.
Okay, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much for helping organize this presentation with Carlene for us.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for coming. And we'll go straight into our Vesper. Brother Crawford.
Okay. Well, with that,
Yes.
go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I know the time is far spent, so without any further ado, I will read the scripture reading for this afternoon. It's taken from Ezra chapter 3, verses 10 through 11. And it says, "And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they sent the priests and their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites and the sons of Asaph with cymbals to praise the Lord, after the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang together and by course of praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth forever towards Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid." So, my topic for today's presentation is praise and thanksgiving. So, for the next few minutes, 10 to 7 minutes or so, I would like us to focus our attention on that. And I know we're all familiar with this story about Ezra. Some praised while others mourned. So, this praise and thanksgiving, we have no need to say, was entirely appropriate. The house upon which their eyes rested was of sufficient consequence for the Lord to send his word again and again to encourage the builders. The Lord gave his servants a word to speak, and this gratitude all should have expressed when they saw the foundation of the house was laid. But there came another difficulty. Lamentation and weeping and mourning was heard because the temple was not outwardly so glorious as the first. They were those who used their conversational powers to talk of the inferiority of the building to the one built by Solomon, mingled with music and singing, with rejoicing and praise to God, was an inharmonious song, not of joy or praise or thanksgiving, but of dissatisfaction. They saw enough to make them praise God. They saw that the Lord had visited them after he had scattered them for their ingratitude and disloyalty to his commandments. He had moved upon the heart of Cyrus to aid those who were appointed to rebuild his house. But those who were easily discouraged did not walk by faith. They entertained discouraging sentiments that were not a savor of life unto good works. Ezra was the son of Aaron, a priest, whom God chose to be an instrument of good unto Israel, that he might put honor unto the priesthood, the glory of which had been greatly eclipsed during the captivity. Ezra was a man of great piety and holiness, and he observed the Sabbath and kept the feast days with diligence.
Sister Slowly, I think Brother Crawford is off. I think he got knocked off.
I think his internet went down.
Okay, so
There is an email from someone here to from Deborah Ann. Is she still on the call? Deborah Ann?
Yes, I am. I'm here.
Okay, so I believe that there was some information that was because I see your chat here. You have several chats. Were you able to provide me with your first and last name? I think that's the first question.
It's right there in the chat. The name is there and the phone number.
I'm looking. It says Deborah Ann. What is your last name, please?
Harry, Harry.
Hello,
Okay.
I'm back. I'm sorry about that.
I have your number.
Mr.
Isa.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. We were disconnected. I'm sorry. So as we continue, I said Ezra, we were talking about him being qualified. So these qualifications made him an eminent man. Ezra was impressed by the Spirit of God to search the historical and poetic books of the Bible. And by this means, he became familiar with the sense and understanding of the law. During the captivity, the knowledge of God's will had to some extent been lost. So Ezra gathered all the copies of the law that he could find. He published copies of these among God's people and became a teacher of the law and the prophecies in the school of the prophets. The pure word, thus diligently taught by Ezra, gave knowledge that was invaluable at the time. So God gave Ezra another opportunity to show his forbearance. The Lord raised up Ezra to be his servant. He moved upon the heart of the king so that Ezra found favor with him. The king placed in his hands abundant means for the rebuilding of the temple and made it possible for the Jews to return who for 70 years had been in captivity in Babylon. In thus giving to his people another opportunity to serve God in their own country, the Lord shows his forbearance and his wayward children. So this begs the question of, shall we let the example of Ezra teach us to use what we should make of our knowledge of the scripture? The life of this servant of God should be an inspiration to us to serve the Lord with heart and mind and strength. We each have an appointed work to do, and this can be accomplished only by consecrated effort. We need first to set ourselves to know the requirements of God and then to practice them. Then we can sow seeds of truth that will bear fruit unto eternal life. Ezra and his companions are determined to fear and obey God and to put this trust wholly in him. They would not form a connection with the world in order to secure the help of or friendship of the enemies of God. Whether they were with the many or the few, they knew that the success could come from God only. And they had no desire that their success should be attributed to the wealth or influence of wicked men. Ezra would run the risk of trusting his cause with God. He well knew that if they failed in their important work, it would be because they had not complied with the requirements of God, and therefore he could not help them. The scriptures furnish abundant evidence that it is safer to be joined to the Lord and lose the favor of friendship of the world than to look to the world for favor and support and forget our dependence upon God. It was because they were convinced of this truth that the Jews had refused to allow their adversaries to unite with them in the work of building the temple. They saw in the propositions of these idolaters a device of Satan to beguile God's people into union and friendship with his enemies. Ezra had the true spirit of prayer, presenting his petition before God for Israel when they had sinned grievously in the face of great light and privileges. He exclaimed, I am ashamed and blush to lift up his face to thee, O God. For our iniquities are increased over our head, and our trespass is grown up unto the heavens. Ezra remembered the goodness of God in again giving his people a foothold in their native land. And he was overwhelmed with indignation and grief at the thought of their ingratitude in return of the divine favor. His language is that of true humiliation of soul and contrition that prevails with God in prayer. Only the prayer of the humble enters the ear of the Lord of the Sabbath. So my prayer and admonition for us all is that we will give God all the thanks and the praise in and out of season. Likewise, we will be more grateful and give God praises and gratitude for the many and obvious blessings in our lives. We shouldn't just equate giving God thanks for the big and noticeable blessings, but rather the simple and mundane things we oftentimes take for granted. So may God bless us all and help us to give thanks in all situations, circumstances, and in all things. Thank you very much.
Amen.
Amen, Brother Crawford.
At this time, we'll pray to close. Eternal Father, dear Jesus, we thank you for your presence with us throughout this Sabbath day. I pray, dear God, that from the presentation we received today, knowing all the information and the tips that's available out there for us during this pandemic season, I pray, dear God, that we may be able to recognize you for all the wondrous things you've done in our lives. Help us, dear God, to be grateful and to be thankful for your many blessings, not only for the big things, dear God, but for all the little blessings that you've bestowed upon us day in and day out. I pray, dear God, that you will continue to bless us and grant us a productive and a safe week. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Is Pastor on the line? Do we have any announcements?
I'm here, but we have no announcement except for our meeting tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock.
Okay. Thank you very much. And good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you
Mr.
so
Reza?
much.
Mr. Reza?
Yes.